Back in 1976, there was a woman everyone trusted. She waved at neighbors, baked pies, mowed her lawn every Sunday. No one looked twice at the yellow house beside the corner mailbox. Why would they? She looked harmless. But psychologists say the human brain does something dangerous. It sees what it expects to see. A quiet old woman becomes kind, lonely, safe, and sometimes that's exactly how monsters disappear in plain sight. Because the most dangerous people rarely look dangerous. They wear housecoats, smile politely, and ask about your children. Tonight, we're stepping inside a case that shocked an entire neighborhood. A story about a master manipulator who hid a criminal empire behind the image of a sweet grandmother, while the people next door kept waving good morning. And before we open those jars sitting quietly on that porch, ask yourself something. Do you truly know your neighbors? Or only the version they want you to see? Get ready. This is psychology of the perfect disguise. The humidity of that July in 1976 was the kind that sat on your chest like a wet wool blanket. I can still hear the loud buzz of the cicadas in the trees and the steady thwack of the screen door every time my son ran out to play in the sprinkler. We lived on Oakhaven Lane, a small street where we thought everyone knew everything about their neighbors. Or, at least, that is what we told ourselves back then. Mrs. Gable lived in the yellow house right next door. She was a widow who always looked very neat in her floral housecoats, even when she was just walking to the end of the driveway to get her mail. To everyone on the block, she was the perfect picture of a lonely, quiet grandmother. She was the kind of woman you would never think twice about. But looking back now, there was a stillness in that house that was not peaceful at all. It felt heavy, like a storm that was about to break. It all started with the glass jars she kept lined up on her front porch. At first, they looked like simple decorations, but they held a secret that would change how I saw my neighborhood forever. We thought we were looking at a lonely woman, but we were actually looking at something much more dangerous. We just didn't know it yet. Life back then was measured in Sunday potlucks and the clean, sharp smell of Tide laundry soap hanging on the line to dry. I was 32 years old at the time, and my days were a blur. I was constantly juggling my part-time job at the local library with the endless energy of two kids who seemed determined to track every bit of dirt from the playground into my kitchen. It was a busy life, but it was a good one. Mrs. Gable was a permanent part of that daily routine. Every afternoon, she would be out on her porch, clutching a tall glass of iced tea as she watched the neighborhood go by. Her silver hair was always perfectly set, not a single strand out of place. She had lived in that yellow house for 20 years, which was much longer than any of the rest of us. Because she had been there so long, she felt like the foundation of the street, someone who had seen it all and stayed exactly the same. My husband, Arthur, always tried to look out for her. Every Saturday morning, he would mow her small patch of lawn as a neighborly favor. He never asked for money, and she never offered it, but she had her own way of saying thank you. She would come to the door with a small plate of lemon bars. They were delicious, tart and sweet, but there was something about those moments that always felt a little off. When she handed Arthur the plate, she would give him a smile, but it never quite reached her eyes. Her expression always felt a bit frozen, like she was wearing a mask. At the time, we didn't think much of it. We just assumed it was the lingering sadness from losing her husband, Thomas, about 10 years before. We figured she was just a woman living in the past, holding on to a life that was gone. It felt like a safe, predictable world back then, and we had no reason to look closer at the woman living just a few feet away. But that safety was just an illusion, and the lemon bars were just the beginning of the story. The first time I felt that strange prickle on the back of my neck was a quiet Tuesday evening. The air had turned heavy and cool, and I could see dark clouds rolling in from the west. I was rushing to pull the dry laundry off the line before the rain started to fall. As I reached for the last few towels, I happened to look over at Mrs. Gable's porch. The sun had almost set, leaving the world in a hazy gray light. Even though it was getting dark, Mrs. Gable didn't have a single light on inside her house. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, tucked away in the deep shadows of her porch. At first, I thought she was just enjoying the breeze, but then I noticed she wasn't holding her usual glass of iced tea. Instead, she was cradling a small, clear mason jar in both hands. She was leaning over it, her lips moving in a low, rhythmic whisper. It was a soft, melodic murmur, the exact kind of gentle voice you would use to calm a crying baby. It felt so private and so odd that I stayed frozen for a second, just watching her. When she finally noticed me standing there with my basket of laundry, she didn't jump or look embarrassed. She didn't act like she had been caught doing something weird at all. She simply stopped talking, slowly placed the jar on the floor behind a large flower pot, and stood up. She walked back into her dark house without saying a word or waving like she usually did. That night at dinner, I couldn't get the image out of my head. I told Arthur what I had seen while I served him his plate. He just laughed it off and shook his head. "She's probably just lonely, Vera," he said, reaching for the salt. "Older folks get lonely, and they start talking to things. Some people talk to their plants, and maybe she just likes talking to her jars. It's just an old woman's quirk." I tried to nod and agree with him. I really wanted to believe he was right. I wanted to think that our neighborhood was still the same safe place it had always been. But as the rain began to drum against our kitchen window, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had hidden that jar. It didn't feel like a lonely habit. It felt like a secret. By August, what I had called a quirk turned into a frightening pattern. Mrs. Gable changed. She stopped going to the grocery store altogether, and I realized I hadn't seen her walking to the mailbox in weeks. Instead, the neighborhood silence was broken every Thursday morning at exactly 3 a.m. I only knew this because our youngest son had a terrible case of the croup, and I spent those long nights pacing the living room floor, trying to soothe him. From the window, I watched a sleek black car pull into her driveway. A man would step out wearing a dark suit that looked way too expensive and formal for our simple street. He didn't carry bags of food or household supplies. Instead, he would lug heavy wooden crates into her side door. They looked just like the filing boxes you would see in a big city office. Even more unsettling were the jars on her porch. There weren't just one or two anymore. There were dozens of them now, lined up like a tiny glass army. They weren't empty, either. They were filled with a thick, dark liquid that looked like heavy oil or old syrup. Whatever was inside them was hidden from the light, and it made my skin crawl just looking at them. Then, the mystery moved inside my own house. Back in those days, phone lines would sometimes get crossed, and you could hear other people's conversations. One afternoon, I picked up the receiver to call the library, but the line wasn't empty. I heard Mrs. Gable's voice, but she didn't sound like a sweet old neighbor anymore. Her voice was sharp and cold. She wasn't talking about recipes or weather. She was reading off long strings of numbers, over and over, with perfect precision. A man's deep voice on the other end simply replied, "Confirmed. The ledger is updated." My hands started to shake, and I hung up the phone as fast as I could. I tried to tell myself that maybe she was just helping someone with their taxes or doing some late-life paperwork. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Mrs. Gable didn't own a typewriter, and she hadn't held a job in decades. As I sat in my quiet kitchen, I realized the woman next door wasn't just lonely. She was working. And whatever she was doing, it had nothing to do with being a friendly neighbor. The police didn't arrive with loud sirens or flashing lights. They came quietly in 3 plain, unmarked cars on a Tuesday morning while my kids were away at the community pool. I was standing at my kitchen window, a dish towel in my hand, and I simply froze as I watched men in windbreakers walk up Mrs. Gable's driveway. I expected them to find something violent, like a body or a weapon, because that was the only way I could make sense of the fear I had been feeling. But what they brought out of that house was even more confusing. They carried out those mason jars, hundreds of them, that they had pulled from deep inside her cellar. Then came the heavy wooden crates I had seen delivered in the middle of the night. The truth came out slowly over the next few days, and it shook our whole town. It turned out that Mrs. Gable was not a lonely widow at all. She was actually the main record keeper for a massive illegal money operation that stretched across 3 states. We all thought her husband Thomas had died 10 years ago, but that was a lie. He had actually disappeared into a secret government witness program, and Mrs. Gable had stayed behind to manage the family's business records. Those jars on the porch weren't filled with food or preserves. They were filled with special tiny film called microfilm and secret notebooks. She had submerged them in thick oil to protect the documents from moisture or even a fire. Every hour she spent sitting on that porch, looking like a quiet old woman, she was actually acting as a lookout. She was watching the street and guarding a giant network of hidden money. The woman we thought was our friend was actually the brain behind a criminal empire, and she had been watching us just as much as we had been watching her. They finally led her away in handcuffs. She didn't look like the criminals you see in the movies. She looked exactly like the same woman who had handed my husband plates of lemon bars for years. The only difference was the way she stood. Her back was perfectly straight, and her face was cold and focused. There was no trace of the sweet grandmother left in her eyes. It was a look of someone who had been playing a very long game and had finally been caught. The yellow house sat empty for 2 long years after that. No one in town wanted to buy it. It felt like the house itself was stained by the secrets it had held. Even after a nice young couple finally moved in, I couldn't look at that front porch without seeing the shadows of the past. I realized then that you can live just 10 feet away from someone for an entire decade and never truly know who they are. You only see the floral housecoat because that is exactly what they want you to see. It was a mask, and she had worn it perfectly. I still have the recipe for those lemon bars she used to give us. It's tucked away in the back of my kitchen drawer. I can't bring myself to throw it away, maybe because it reminds me of a time when I felt safe. But I can't bring myself to bake them, either. Every time I see her handwriting on that yellowed card, I think of the jars and the secret phone calls. There is a bitterness to that memory that no amount of sugar could ever fix. The neighborhood eventually went back to normal, but for me, the quiet of Oakhaven Lane would never feel quite the same again. The world felt a little less certain after that summer ended. I learned a hard lesson that stayed with me for the rest of my life. The quietest houses often hold the loudest secrets. Those secrets were tucked away where no one thought to look, hidden in plain sight inside glass jars and dark cellar corners. While the mystery of Mrs. Gable was finally solved that day, it left me with a lingering feeling of doubt. I often find myself driving through old neighborhoods, looking at people sitting on their porches and waving as I go by. Now, I can't help but wonder how many of them are hiding their own stories behind a friendly smile. If you enjoy immersive stories like this that explore the shadows of the past, please consider subscribing for more emotional suspense stories. We all have neighbors, and we all like to think we know our community. But the truth is, we don't always know who the people living right next to us really are. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the hidden truths behind the most ordinary doors.